for 7 years. And you're already probably saying, wait, don't tell me I know the story already. It's the basic story of, English class, that plot development timeline where you're like, oh, I weigh too much. Then you read an inspiring article. You discover some kind of secret method. After a period of toil and trouble and maybe some journeying, you reach the goal, buy some new pants, someone told me I look good, and skinny ever after, the end. So that was me in 2006. Then I read Michael Pollan's Unhappy Meals, which later turned into Omnivore's Dilemma, but just the idea of eat food, not too much, mostly plants, sent me on this path. I read a whole bunch of other books. I kind of tried to educate myself on what was I doing wrong and what could I change to make long-term changes. And one of the books was The Hacker's Diet, and it's this amazingly nerdy quantified self book from 2 decades ago that was like, okay, so all you have to do is track your weight every day, weigh yourself every day, and then ignore it, and plot the 10-day running average and use that to figure out if what you're doing has worked. So this is my first year of data. I went from 175 to 160-ish. And then after the second year, I'd reached my goal of 155. It was really slow, success, skinny ever after. But what I want to talk about tonight is the rest of the story. So that whole period was 5 years ago, and in the past 5 years, I've continued to track my weight, and with the sole goal of just staying where I am, so that I don't have to go through that again. And I realized there is a massive gap in the middle. I was traveling for a long time, and then for a while I had a scale that I realized was actually giving me bad data, so I didn't include that here. All of this data is from the We Think scale. So it's actually, 16 months is still enough to give you some interesting insights about what tracking for staying steady will do. So all the dots, basically what I do is I just weigh myself at the beginning of every day that I'm home. I travel a lot, so I don't really worry about missing that, and if I forget, I don't worry about it. It's not a very high stress activity for me. So I step on the scale, those are the dots. And what I pay attention to is kind of the 10-day running average longer term. So if you take out what I consider to be noise of the individual dots and just pay attention to the longer term trend, for me that's made this really good early warning system. So this is like 16 months of data, and this whole range on the graph is like 5.5 pounds, which is a pretty small range to stay in for that long. And I think the average was like 144 with a standard deviation of 1 pound. So that means that 2/3 of the time I'm within 1 pound of my average weight. So it's working. And what's working is that when I see a trend that goes up like this, it kind of like triggers a kind of alert system in me where I go from just doing my normal everyday self to bringing a lot more mindfulness to the situation, and usually that means eating a little less or coming back to something. So just to look at this example of, because there's a bunch of those ups and then I trend back down. So this is the beginning of the period, and the dots are kind of all over the place, and maybe I wouldn't have seen it right away, but the 10-day running average that kind of takes out all the water weight variation and all of that, this is what I consider to be a more true measure of the weight, is there's definitely an upward trend. The interesting thing is that the upward trends that you can see by plotting this are really small, so this is just a 2-pound variation, and like for me that's like day to day, 2 pounds is just water weight, like for someone my size, so that doesn't really matter, but 2 pounds in the underlying number does matter. And so then I start to kind of inspect more closely what I'm doing and change my behavior. And I really don't think I would see stuff like this if I wasn't tracking my weight, because like 2 pounds over 3 weeks isn't enough for someone as tall as I am to really feel it in like the way my clothes fit or how I look. So then I just kind of correct trend. And so what has been working for this kind of skinny ever after like long-term tracking period for me is having these this system of triggers. So the white zone, I'm fine, I'm really not paying attention. Anytime I get into the blue zone, then I start to be much more mindful of what I'm doing. Usually I start eating less, and because it's such a small amount of eating less in such a short time that you need to do that for, it doesn't actually make a big difference in like the pain, like it's not an inconvenience to me. And so I turn that around and get back into this normal zone before, instead of being like 1 pound or 2 pounds up, then I'm like 10 pounds up and I actually have to go on a real diet because I'd like to avoid that. And it also, it's kind of a good nudge to returning to what works. So usually when I have gotten into like too high or too low, it's just because I'm stressed out and I need to pay more attention to eating the diet that I like to eat, cooking, doing the kind of exercise that I found works for me, like spending time with myself. So don't be afraid to track things that are really boring. Like tracking a straight line is really boring, but it's also really useful. So all the references that I found helpful, I just put bit.ly links to them in case you want it. And I love talking about this, so I'd love to answer any questions.
Excellent. Yes, Angela.
My doctor retired and wrote a book. His name's Michael Nierenberg, and his thesis was that you put on weight at things like parties and events, and if you just went to those events and just cherry-picked sort of the good foods and didn't try and eat everything at a buffet or something, you would not actually put on weight. And I wondered whether you had, when you looked at your little uphills, whether they were things like parties, and I know for me a glass of wine will set my weight going way up. So I wondered what other triggers you'd found.
Definitely the holidays. If I'm not being really careful, like those are pretty obvious ones. I think I have learned that, and I kind of have adjusted my behavior at parties accordingly. I've also, for the past 3 years, my dad has been tracking his weight, and so he lost quite a bit of weight in his graph. Also, like, he shares it with me in Google Docs, and so I could always tell when he's had a barbecue weekend, because it's exactly that. But he's like aware of that. It's just like, oh, that's what I'm doing. So yeah, I definitely have learned from it more in the past period. I think I've kind of stabilized in what I do now.
So what tool do you use to track your weight? You know, what do you enter it into? You said something about sharing it with Google Docs. Do you enter your data just into Google Docs raw, or what?
So for a long time, I had a regular scale, and I wrote down the number in a notebook every day, and then I put it into Excel every few weeks and look at that. My dad shares his in Google Docs with me, and now I just use a WeThings scale, and I download the CSV and put it into Python. And
I think Kata might not know what a WeThings scale is. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, it's just a scale that has a wireless component, so when you step on it, it uses your household wireless and sends data to the internet.
And the thing that I want to add is that the smoothing function that Amelia was talking about, that's automatically generated by WeThings. You can be a total non-techie and you still get that data.
Yeah.
Let's go here and then to Helen.
Have you found that over time the effort that it takes you to maintain your desired weight has gone down?
Yes, definitely. As I've learned more about what works, it doesn't take a lot of effort.
Hi, I was wondering if you found any patterns with weight and, like, say, like your menstrual cycle.
I'm really interested in that, and I also track that, and I haven't put them together because I haven't initially seen any cyclical variations. But maybe in a few years when I have like more steady WeThings data, like just in the steady period, then I can do some analysis and figure that out.
Other questions? Joe? No? Oh, sorry. He's telling me the time. Any other questions for Amelia? Yes. Heather.
Just out of curiosity, I noticed there was a lot of gaps. Is that because you were traveling and you didn't have the scale available?
Yeah, I do a lot of traveling and a lot of backpacking and like mountaineering too, and I just kind of decided to not worry about it. Yeah, I mean there are a ton of gaps in the past year, and it still stayed pretty steady. My conclusion is that you can make really good decisions based on like kind of sparse data. So.
I love the idea that you're just looking at the trends and and I love the idea of tracking something steady. I'm wondering, when you do hit these warning points, do you look at this graph or this graphic representation regularly, or is there some other way you get notice when you go into the blue?
Now so I'm like the kind of person who did like travel math team in middle school, so I do the averages in my head a lot of times, and I only go look at it when I kind of like think there might be something up and want to confirm my suspicions. But when I was like actively trying to lose weight, I was looking at it much more regularly.
Cool. Here and then there.
Okay, well, one, when you have had a gap and you start up again, does the blue line start the first day that you put a new weight in, or does it do it, since it's a 10-day moving average, does it start after like the 10th day? And also, out of curiosity, how much does a weekly scale cost?
There's also Fitbit makes a scale, and I think that's also the wireless kind of scale, and I think they're both around 100 to 150. And then to the other question, this data, I let it put a point on the blue line if it had 5 or more previous points. But you can kind of pick where fewer points means a jaggedy line.
Do you know before you take your weight what it's going to be? Are you surprised?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't ever try to guess because I don't think the individual number is a big deal. Like today I weighed 141 and I was kind of surprised because that's a lot lower than usual, but yeah, I just try to keep the bigger picture in mind and not guess.
So you do look at it every day, though?
Well, I look at the actual number when I'm on the scale because then you have to step this way so that it goes to Amelia, not to Adam. And so.
So I was wondering if, since you've been doing this for a number of years, you kind of have an internal sense over time that you've calibrated to when you start to hit the trigger points, especially if you're traveling or backpacking or whatever. You think you kind of have refined your own internal awareness of that?
Definitely. I think what I value most about having a graph is just confirming that internal sense. But I also think I really need it. Like I'm not like smart enough. Like my brain will switch into fooling itself mode as soon as I have like let the rational like checks go.
And final question, Gordon.
You mentioned at the beginning that you had a scale that you used, that you discovered you couldn't trust the results from. So that makes me wonder, what makes you trust the results from your Withings? You know, how did you calibrate it, and how often do you continually check it to make sure it's accurate?
So I think Withings is also not the most accurate of the scales out there, but the scale that I didn't trust was just completely untrustworthy because I realized that one of the, it was an old scale, so it had like the 8-bit, display, and so one of the segments was out, so I wasn't able to tell the difference between when like a 5 and a 6, but I didn't realize that for a long time. So I was kind of like, yep, that's not working. But I also, for a long time, or for most of that period, I didn't track it as often. It wasn't a big deal. Like now I have a lot of data because Withings makes it really easy. Yeah.
Right, but how do you know the Withings isn't changing over time? Or is
I have a set of steel weights that I put on mine periodically, and it's,
Oh, is this a comment?
yeah, it stays pretty stable.
Okay.
I need steel weights.
He does double check me. He puts it on and then it throws off my measurements. Okay, thank you so much, Amelia.